In Sang-ug-yam's luxury restaurant, a dropped fork was a minor offense. A spilled drink was an immediate firing. But a waitress silently weeping in the middle of his golden dining room? That was a death sentence. It was the peak of the dinner rush. Sang-ug sat at the center VIP table, a phantom in a tailored suit, observing his empire. He missed nothing, not the nervous glances of his rivals, and certainly not the young woman standing rigid just 3 feet away. Her name tag read, Angelia. She was immaculate, except for the tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She gripped a silver tray bearing a single empty wineglass so hard her knuckles were white. She wasn't overwhelmed by the shift. She was completely, utterly terrified. Sang-ug watched as his most trusted lieutenant leaned in, handed back that empty glass, and whispered something in her ear. Angelia's breath hitched. She pressed trembling fingers to her temple, looking as though the floor had just fallen out from under her. The lieutenant smirked and walked away. Sang-ug's jaw tightened. In his world, fear was a weapon he controlled. Seeing it inflicted on an innocent employee without his permission wasn't just a mistake. It was an insult. For a long moment, the untouchable kingpin sat perfectly still. Then, he quietly pushed back his chair, excused himself from the table, and followed the weeping woman into the shadows of the back corridors. Stay with me until the end. Because what Sang-ug found hiding in the dark and the brutal choice he made next left every rival, every lieutenant, and every man in his syndicate absolutely speechless. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Hidden Mafia Chronicles, and comment on where you're watching from. The dining room was a symphony of curated perfection, every detail orchestrated to project untouchable wealth. Jazz floated from a grand piano in the corner, weaving through the clatter of silver against porcelain. From his seat at the center table, Sang-ug-yam conducted this symphony with merely a glance. He demanded flawless execution from his staff, a standard they met with eager reverence. Yet, his gaze remained locked on the anomaly standing near the velvet-draped archway. Angelia. Sang-ug watched as his right-hand man, a lieutenant who had bled for the syndicate for over a decade, casually approached her. To the untrained eye of the oblivious billionaires eating truffles a few tables away, it was a picture of mundane courtesy. The lieutenant wore a charming, practiced smile, his posture relaxed as he held out a crystal wineglass. But Sang-ug did not have an untrained eye. He read the geometry of violence better than anyone. He saw the way his lieutenant invaded her personal space, stepping just an inch too close, effectively pinning her against the heavy oak paneling of the archway. Angelia's knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white as she gripped her serving tray. When the lieutenant placed the empty glass onto the polished silver surface, the sharp clink seemed to cut through the ambient hum of the room. Then came the whisper. The lieutenant leaned down, his lips brushing dangerously close to her ear. Sang-ug couldn't hear the words over the piano, but he saw the devastating physical impact they carried. Angelia's shoulders hitched sharply. Her composure, while previously as immaculate as her pressed black uniform, splintered into 1,000 jagged pieces. A single tear broke free, tracking down her pale cheek. She raised a trembling hand to her temple, squeezing her eyes shut as if trying to physically hold her mind together. The lieutenant pulled back, his smile widening into a cruel, satisfied smirk. He patted the edge of her tray with a patronizing tap, turned on his heel, and melted back into the crowd toward the private lounges. Angelia stood completely paralyzed, a marble statue weeping in the golden light. Sang-ug slowly set down his linen napkin. He felt no immediate rage, only a cold, creeping, absolute zero. A predator had just hunted inside his sanctuary. Worse, it was one of his own. Angelia remained frozen for exactly 3 seconds. In the brutal mathematics of fine dining, when 3 seconds of stillness was an eternity. She blinked, a jagged breath shuddering through her chest, and forced her eyes open. The tray in her hands shook violently, the single empty wineglass rattling against the silver like a frantic heartbeat. Desperate to escape the golden glare of the chandeliers, she turned. Her movements were stiff, robotic, completely devoid of the graceful, invisible glide Sang-ug required of his floor staff. She practically threw herself toward the swinging service doors, vanishing into the shadowed threshold of the back corridors before anyone else could witness her fracture. Anyone else except the man who owned the room. At the center table, the conversation continued to hum. A shipping magnate to Sang-ug's left laughed loudly, gesturing with an unlit cigar. I was oblivious to the quiet devastation that had just occurred mere feet away. Sang-ug did not smile. His instincts, sharpened by decades of surviving street-level betrayals and high-rise blood feuds, flared to life with chilling clarity. He replayed the lieutenant's smirk. He analyzed the waitress's sheer unadulterated terror. That was not a manager scolding a subordinate over a missed table setting. That was the face of a woman who had just been handed a death sentence, and it had happened under his roof, under his protection, by his own blood-sworn man. Sang-ug stood. The movement was so smooth, so deliberately controlled, that it barely rippled the dark fabric of his tailored suit. The VIP table fell silent instantly, the magnate's laughter dying abruptly in his throat at the sudden shift in the boss's aura. Sang-ug offered a polite, hollow inclination of his head. "Excuse me, gentlemen. A minor operational matter requires my immediate attention. Please, enjoy the vintage." He didn't wait for their nervous nods of deference. He stepped away from the warm, romantic glow of the dining floor, his footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rugs. Bypassing the bustling main kitchen, he ignored the flurry of line cooks and the hiss of searing meat, his dark eyes fixed entirely on the heavy mahogany doors where Angelia had disappeared. He was no longer the gracious host of a luxury establishment. He was the king of the syndicate, stepping into the shadows to hunt a sickness in his own house. The heavy swinging doors sealed shut behind him, cutting off the warm jazz of the dining room and plunging Sang-ug into the chaotic heat of the main kitchen. It was a battlefield of blinding stainless steel and searing flames, a symphony of shouting cooks and clattering copper pans. Yet, as the boss moved down the central aisle, the chaos immediately parted. Line cooks froze mid-chop, instinctively bowing their heads. The head chef swallowed his orders, dropping his gaze to the floor. Sang-ug did not acknowledge them. He drifted through the glaring fluorescent lights like a phantom, his focus singular and absolute. He found his first marker at the edge of the prep stations, a silver tray hastily abandoned atop a stack of linen crates. On it sat a single empty wine glass, still vibrating slightly from the heavy machinery of the kitchen. She had dropped it in her blind panic. Without breaking his stride, Sang-ug pushed past the reinforced secondary doors, leaving the heat and noise behind. The atmosphere shifted violently. The storage wing was a labyrinth of dimly lit, temperature-controlled corridors. The air here was heavy and cold, smelling of aged oak, damp stone, and total isolation. The muffled bass of the piano from the floor above only emphasized the suffocating silence of the hall. Flickering tungsten bulbs cast long, distorted shadows against the cinder-block walls. Down here, the golden illusion of the luxury restaurant was entirely stripped away, leaving only the cold, hard bones of his empire. Sang-ug walked with the terrifying silence of an apex predator in its own den, his expensive leather shoes making absolutely no sound against the bare concrete. He didn't need to guess her path, he simply followed the electric trail of her distress. He noted the scuffed mark of a rubber-soled uniform shoe turning a sharp corner. He saw the disturbed dust motes hanging in the still air. The deeper he descended into the belly of the building, the colder his blood ran. He slowed his pace as he approached the heavy iron grate of the vintage wine reserve, the most isolated corner of the property. From within the dense dark rows of glass bottles, a sound finally broke the heavy silence. A muffled, desperate sob, followed immediately by the low, cruel voice of the man Sang-ug had trusted with his life. Sang-ug stopped just beyond the reach of the single swinging bulb outside the reserve. Through the wrought iron grate, the cellar was a claustrophobic maze of floor-to-ceiling mahogany racks housing rare vintages that cost more than most men made in a lifetime. Hidden within the narrowest aisle, Shrouded in the heavy scent of old oak and damp cork, Sang-ug found them. He melted into the pitch-black alcove near the entrance, a phantom bearing witness to the rot inside his own house. Angelia was completely trapped. Her back was pressed flush against a wall of $1,000 Bordeaux, her fingers white as she gripped the iron lattice of the shelving behind her. The lieutenant, a man who had stood at Sang-ug's right hand during a dozen brutal turf wars, had her pinned. He slammed a heavy palm into the wood just inches from her face, the impact making the expensive glass bottles rattle together like terrified teeth. "I'm done asking nicely, Angelia," the lieutenant hissed. The charming, polished facade he had worn in the dining room was completely stripped away, leaving only the snarling street thug he had apparently never outgrown. "Your brother had a week. He blew it. Now the interest has compounded, and frankly, I don't care if he sells his blood to pay it. It's not enough." "Please," Angelia gasped, a broken, breathless sound that barely escaped her trembling lips. "We just need a few more days. The bakery will turn a profit this month, I swear it to you. Don't hurt him." "I don't want the profit," the lieutenant spat. He leaned closer until she was forced to turn her face away, choking on a sob. "I want the property. You're going to bring me the deed to that pathetic little family bakery by tomorrow night, signed, sealed, and legally transferred to my holding company." "It's all my mother has left," she pleaded, sinking slightly as her knees threatened to give out. "You can't take it. She'll have nothing." The lieutenant reached out, his fingers viciously twisting into the collar of her immaculate uniform to haul her back up. "I can take whatever I want. That's the beauty of my position. You sign over the deed tomorrow, or I send 2 men to your mother's shop, lock the doors, and burn it to the ground with your brother inside." In the shadows, Sang-ug's breathing stopped. The extortion wasn't just a betrayal of the syndicate's strict, honorable code. It was sloppy, parasitic, and executed using the very fear that Sang-ug himself had carefully cultivated. The empire he had built to rise above the gutter was being dragged right back into the mud by his closest friend. The words hung in the damp, chilled air of the reserve, toxic and suffocating. "Burn it to the ground." In the pitch-black alcove, Sang-ug closed his eyes. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. To the terrified waitress and the snarling lieutenant a few feet away, the shadows were completely empty. But within that darkness, a king was silently mourning the illusion of his own reign. Sang-ug had spent 15 years clawing his way out of the gutter to build a syndicate governed by strict, unbreakable laws. He dealt in high-stakes logistics, political influence, and controlled, necessary violence. He did not bleed civilians. He certainly did not extort weeping women for the deeds to family bakeries. That was the petty, parasitic work of scavengers. Yet, the scavenger wearing the Italian silk suit just inches away was no low-level enforcer. This was the man who had taken a bullet for Sang-ug during the dockyard wars. The man who had poured the celebratory drinks the night they finally took the city. They were supposed to be brothers, elevated above the filth of the streets they had conquered. Now, listening to his oldest friend twist his fingers into Angelia's uniform, Sang-ug realized the terrifying truth of his absolute power. The fortress of fear he had built to keep his enemies out had simply allowed the monsters to thrive safely inside. The rot was deep. If his right-hand man was running unauthorized rackets right under his nose, using the terrible weight of Sang-ug's name as a weapon for personal greed, the entire foundation of his organization was diseased. The discipline he demanded from his men was a lie. They didn't share his honorable code, they merely hid their savagery in his shadow. A heavy, suffocating regret settled over Sang-ug's chest, cold and metallic. It wasn't the hesitation of a man afraid to spill blood. But it was the profound, exhausting grief of a leader who realizes the only way to save his house is to tear out its supporting beams. In his world, there were no warnings. There were no demotions. The code was absolute, and the penalty for mocking it was final. To cleanse the rot, to protect this innocent girl, he would have to execute the man he had trusted with his life. He would have to do it here, in the dark, and he would have to do it himself. Sang-ug opened his eyes. The brief moment of mourning was over. The quiet observer died, replaced entirely by the ruthless predator the underworld feared. With a chilling, deliberate silence, his right hand slid beneath the lapel of his tailored jacket, his fingers wrapping around the cold steel resting at his ribs. The lieutenant drew breath to deliver his final, crushing ultimatum. But the words died instantly in his throat. A shadow had detached itself from the pitch-black alcove. Sang-ug stepped out of the absolute darkness and into the harsh, flickering pool of the single tungsten bulb. He did not rush. He did not draw the weapon resting against his ribs. He simply appeared, a terrifying, monolithic figure in a flawless dark suit, commanding the claustrophobic space of the wine reserve with his mere presence. The ambient, distant hum of the building seemed to vanish entirely, sucked away into a ringing, suffocating silence. The lieutenant froze. For a fraction of a second, his brain violently rejected what his eyes were seeing, the impossibility of the king leaving his throne in the middle of a high-stakes VIP service. Then, the catastrophic reality crashed over him. The arrogant, untouchable smirk that had been plastered across his face dissolved, replaced by the pale, hollow slackness of a corpse. His hand dropped from Angelia's uniform, as if the black fabric had suddenly caught fire. He took a stumbling, clumsy half-step back, his mouth opening and closing, but his vocal cords were completely paralyzed by terror. Freed from his brutal grip, Angelia slumped against the mahogany racks, a ragged gasp tearing from her lungs. But her relief was violently short-lived. Through her blurred, tear-filled vision, she recognized the man standing at the edge of the light, the absolute boss. The phantom the entire city feared but rarely saw. If the lieutenant was a monster, Sang-ug Yum was the devil himself. A new, paralyzing dread washed over her. In her terrified mind, there was only one reason the head of the syndicate would be in this damp cellar. She was a liability. She was a lowly waitress who had just witnessed syndicate business, an untidy loose end that threatened the pristine reputation of his golden establishment. Her legs gave out completely. She slid slowly down the heavy wooden shelving, the $1,000 bottles clinking softly above her as she hit the cold concrete floor. Pulling her knees to her chest, she wrapped her arms around herself and squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable deafening crack of a gunshot. She waited for her sudden execution in the dark, completely unaware that the predator standing in the light wasn't looking at her at all. His dead obsidian eyes were locked entirely on his oldest friend. The silence stretched. I tilted his head. His obsidian eyes tilted his head. His obsidian eyes stripping away the man's expensive silk suit, his syndicate rank, and their shared history, leaving only the trembling parasite beneath. "A bakery," Sang-ug said softly. The volume of his voice barely hovered above a whisper, yet it struck the damp cellar walls with the force of a physical blow. The lieutenant swallowed hard, the muscles in his neck cording with sudden desperate tension. "Boss, Sang-ug, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. The brother, he runs a numbers game on the side. He owed." "You are shaking down a waitress," Sang-ug interrupted, his tone as perfectly chilled as the vintage champagne surrounding them. "In my restaurant, while I sit 50 feet away." He took a single, slow step forward, his shadow swallowing the light. "Tell me, how long has my name been used to collect scraps from the gutter?" "It's not scraps," the lieutenant blurted out, panic rapidly dissolving his street discipline. "It's a network. Dry cleaners, bodegas, bakeries. They pay a premium for the territory. It's a clean revenue stream, boss, untraceable. I was building a slush fund for the family." "For the family," Sang-ug echoed hollowly. The lie tasted like ash in the room. He watched a drop of cold sweat trace the line of the lieutenant's jaw. If it were for the family, it would be in the ledgers. If it were for the family, you wouldn't be threatening to burn an innocent woman alive in the shadows of my cellar. Another slow step. The lieutenant's back hit a rack of Pinot Noir, the heavy glass shivering violently against the wood. "How many?" Sang-ug demanded, the absolute zero of his voice finally dropping to reveal the lethal crushing pressure beneath. "How many civilians are you bleeding under my crest?" The lieutenant's eyes darted wildly toward the iron grate, seeking an exit that didn't exist. 30, he choked out, his voice cracking. Maybe 40 storefronts. It was just business, Sang-ug. We built this city. We're entitled to tax it. The confession hung in the freezing air, a grotesque monument to greed. 40 families extorted, 40 businesses living in absolute terror of a king who didn't even know they were suffering. Sang-ug had not just been betrayed, his entire legacy had been weaponized against the very city he sought to control. He looked at the man he once called a brother. The interrogation was over. The verdict was already sealed. The word entitled echoed against the damp concrete, a vile, pathetic sound that sealed the lieutenant's fate. Sang-ug did not blink. The profound grief that had weighed on his chest just moments ago hardened into something brittle, cold, and absolute. In the underworld, power was a delicate architecture. Allow one cracked pillar to stand, and the entire roof would eventually cave in. The man trembling before him was no longer a brother, no longer a trusted soldier who had bled for the syndicate's crest. He was a parasite. The lieutenant saw the lethal shift in Sang-ug's obsidian eyes. The street-level instincts that had kept him alive for a decade finally overrode his paralyzing awe of the boss. Knowing there was no court of appeals, he made a desperate, suicidal gamble. With an animalistic snarl, he dropped his right hand toward the heavy bulge at his waistband, his fingers frantically clawing for the grip of his own weapon. He was far too slow. Sang-ug's movement was a masterclass in kinetic efficiency. There was no hesitation, no dramatic posturing. His hand slid seamlessly beneath the lapel of his tailored jacket, and in a fraction of a second, the suppressed steel of his pistol was drawn and leveled. The weapon let out a sharp, breathless cough, a sound no louder than a heavy book dropping to the floor, instantly swallowed by the dense, sound-dampening acoustics of the wine reserve. A single, perfectly placed shot tore through the center of the lieutenant's chest. The impact threw the man backward. He slammed violently into the mahogany racks, a horrifying, deep, breathless gasp escaping his lips as his hands flew up to the blossoming dark stain, ruining his Italian silk shirt. For a split second, he stared at Sang-ug, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that the absolute law of the syndicate actually applied to him. Sang-ug's expression remained entirely blank. He adjusted his aim slightly upward and pulled the trigger a second time. The final shot was instantaneous. The lieutenant's eyes rolled back, and he collapsed, sliding down the wooden shelving like a broken marionette. He hit the cold concrete with a heavy, sickening thud. Above him, a bottle of rare vintage slipped from its wooden cradle, shattering against the floor and mixing a deep, rich ruby cascade with the dark blood pooling around the body. Then, an absolute silence descended on the cellar once more. The violence had taken less than 4 seconds. Sang-ug stood perfectly still in the flickering tungsten light, the sleek barrel of his weapon pointed at the floor. The atmosphere in the room rapidly shifted, the heavy scent of old oak and damp cork, violently overwritten by the sharp acidic tang of cordite and copper. He had just severed his own right hand to save the body of his empire. The rule was absolute. The punishment was delivered. The ringing silence hung heavy in the damp air, broken only by the steady rhythmic drip of vintage wine and warm blood mingling on the cold concrete. In the shadows beneath the mahogany racks, Angelia was a trembling, curled-up knot of absolute terror. When the muffled, breathless cracks of the suppressed pistol had echoed through the claustrophobic space, she had squeezed her eyes shut, entirely convinced she was about to die. She had braced for the burning impact, waiting for the dark to claim her. But the pain never came. Instead, the heavy, sickening thud of a body hitting the floor forced her eyes open. Through the dim, flickering tungsten light, she saw her tormentor, the untouchable lieutenant who had promised to burn her family to the ground, lying motionless in a dark, spreading pool, her brain completely short-circuited. The sheer, incomprehensible shock of the sudden violence severed the last fragile threads of her composure. A strangled, high-pitched gasp tore from her throat, and she slumped sideways, her hands clutching her chest as her lungs began to violently hyperventilate. She was drowning in the chilled air, her terrified, tear-filled gaze snapping up to the imposing figure standing just feet away. Sang-ug-yeom did not look at the body. He smoothly engaged the safety of his weapon and slid it back beneath the lapel of his tailored jacket, the movement as casual and precise as a businessman putting away a silver pen. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cold, calculating executioner fade away into the shadows. The man who remained was quiet, grounded, and deeply weary. He looked down at the weeping, hyperventilating woman on the floor. In her wide, panicked eyes, he saw exactly what he was to her, a monster holding a scythe. He needed to pull her back from the edge of a total psychological collapse. Reaching into his breast pocket, Sang-ug withdrew a pristine white silk handkerchief. He stepped forward, his movements slow and meticulously telegraphed so as not to startle her further. He carefully sidestepped the ruined wine and the blood, lowering himself to one knee so he was no longer towering over her. The proximity made Angelia flinch violently. She pressed herself so hard against the wooden shelving that the expensive bottles rattled above her. "Look at me," Sang-ug said softly. It wasn't the icy, crushing tone he had used to condemn the traitor just moments before. It was a firm, steady anchor in the middle of a hurricane. Angelia couldn't stop shaking, her chest heaving, but her wide eyes locked onto his obsidian gaze. "Breathe," he instructed, his voice even, entirely breaking the intimidating myth of the absolute boss. "In, out, you are safe. He cannot hurt you anymore." He held out the white silk handkerchief. Angelia just stared at it, her mind unable to process the terrifying kingpin offering a gesture of comfort. Moving with deliberate care, Sang-ug reached toward a nearby wooden crate, retrieved a chilled, unopened bottle of mineral water, cracked the seal, and placed it gently on the floor beside her trembling hand. "Drink," he urged quietly. "Wipe your face. The worst is over." He didn't rush her. He stayed kneeling on the cold floor, his dark suit blending into the shadows, allowing the terrifying aura of his empire to shrink down to the size of a man simply waiting for a frightened woman to catch her breath. Slowly, agonizingly, Angelia reached out. Her trembling fingers finally brushed the cool silk. Angelia clutched the handkerchief to her chest as if it were a shield, taking the open bottle of water with her other hand. She drank, the freezing mineral water shocking her system out of its paralyzing loop of panic. As she lowered the bottle, she looked at the dead man bleeding out onto the concrete, then cautiously back up to the man who had just casually executed him. Sang-ug's face gave nothing away, but his voice remained a low, steady current. "The bakery," he prompted gently. "Who holds the paper? Give me the name of the holding company he used." Angelia swallowed hard, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. "Ironclad Investments, my brother. He borrowed 50,000. But the interest, it compounded every week. It became 200,000. They were going to take the deed tomorrow." Sang-ug pulled a sleek, took an encrypted phone from his inside pocket. He didn't break eye contact with her as his thumb moved rapidly over the glass, firing off a single authoritative directive to his chief financial enforcer. The cold glow of the screen illuminated the sharp, unforgiving lines of his jaw. "Ironclad Investments is a shell corporation operating under my syndicate's umbrella," Sang-ug stated, his tone completely devoid of the violence that hung heavy in the air. "Which means, ultimately, I own the paper your brother signed. I own the debt." Angelia's breath hitched. A fresh wave of terror threatened to pull her under. Was she simply trading one monster for a more powerful one? Sang-ug saw the fear spike in her wide eyes and immediately moved to extinguish it. "And as the sole owner of that debt," he continued, his voice dropping into a solemn, unbreakable vow, "I am transferring the balance to my personal ledger. As of this exact second, the debt is paid in full. The ledger is wiped clean. Your family owes me, and the syndicate absolutely nothing." Angelia stared at him, the words struggling to penetrate the thick, suffocating fog of her trauma. "Paid," she choked out, her hands shaking. "But the deed remains with your mother," Sang-ug interrupted firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument or doubt. "Tomorrow morning, my personal attorneys will deliver the canceled contract to her shop. The lien will be permanently dissolved." He stood up slowly, towering once more. yet his presence was no longer a threat. He looked down at her, ensuring she understood the absolute gravity of his promise. "Listen to me very carefully, Angelia. To no one bearing my crest will ever step foot inside your mother's bakery again. You have my word as the head of this family. And in this city, my word is the only law that matters." The sheer magnitude of the mercy shattered the last of her defenses. The tears that fell now were not born of terror, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. The untouchable king of the underworld had just burned a piece of his own empire to the ground, simply to keep her family safe. Sang-ug turned away from the trembling woman and the ruin of his oldest friend. He left the white silk handkerchief in her hands, a singular white flag of absolute protection, in a room painted with betrayal. Stepping over the spreading pool of dark blood and shattered vintage glass, he reached the heavy iron grate of the wine reserve. He did not look back. The iron locked shut with a definitive echoing clang, sealing the violence in the cold dark. Moving back down the dimly lit storage corridors, Sang-ug's hands were perfectly steady as he methodically adjusted the cuffs of his pristine white shirt. He ran a thumb along his jawline, checking for any stray splatter, then smoothed the lapels of his tailored jacket. He adjusted his dark tie, pulling the knot flush against his collar. The physical routine was a necessary armor. By the time he pushed through the swinging doors and left the blistering heat of the main kitchen behind, the weary protector was gone. The untouchable kingpin had returned. The transition was jarring. The golden, warm light of the luxury dining room washed over him. The soft, lilting jazz of the grand piano instantly drowning out the phantom echoes of suppressed gunfire. The oblivious elite of the city continued to laugh, clink crystal glasses, and dine on truffles, completely unaware that the tectonic plates of the underworld had just violently shifted beneath their feet. Sang-ug walked silently back to the center VIP table. He did not take his seat immediately. Instead, he remained standing, his hands resting lightly on the back of his leather chair. His dark, obsidian eyes slowly swept the perimeter of the room. At the corner booths and the shadowed edges of the dining floor, his remaining lieutenants and captains sat in quiet conversation. As Sang-ug's gaze passed over them, the conversations died. One by one, the hardened men felt the sudden crushing drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. Oh, they looked up, their practiced smiles fading into tense lines. They saw the boss standing alone, and they noticed the subtle, terrifying absence of the man who had always stood at his right hand. But more terrifying than the absence was the look in Sang-ug's eyes. The usual calm, calculated authority had been replaced by a dead, hollow, absolute zero. He stared them down, stripping away their expensive suits and polite nods of deference, searching for the hidden rot beneath their loyalty. He knew now that the infection ran deep. An extortion ring of that magnitude required soldiers, collectors, and silence. The men staring back at him were no longer his trusted brothers. They were suspects in a treasonous conspiracy. Sang-ug slowly took his seat, his posture rigid and utterly unreadable. Tonight, the king had drawn blood. And tomorrow, the purge would begin. The golden chandeliers of the luxury dining room cast the same warm, flawless glow they always had, yet the atmosphere had fundamentally shifted. 3 weeks had passed since the night the earth cracked beneath the syndicate. The violent surgical purge that followed had stripped the empire down to its iron studs, removing the rot with absolute, unforgiving precision. Now, the dust had settled. The restaurant hummed with the familiar clatter of silver against porcelain and the soft, lilting rhythm of the grand piano. It was a symphony of curated perfection once more, but the underlying tension, the invisible weight of parasites feeding in the shadows, was entirely gone. Gliding seamlessly between the tables, Angelia moved with a quiet, undeniable grace. The rigid, terrified posture that had once frozen her in place was a memory. Her black uniform was as immaculate as ever, but the pallor of her cheeks had been replaced by a healthy, vibrant warmth. As she poured a vintage Bordeaux for a wealthy shipping magnate, a genuine, relaxed smile touched her lips. She wasn't just surviving her shift anymore. She was untouchable. The morning after the nightmare in the cellar, a sleek black car had pulled up to her mother's bakery, delivering a canceled contract and a promise that no one dared to break. The crushing weight of the debt was gone, replaced by an invisible shield that every remaining member of the syndicate recognized and fiercely respected. She finished pouring the wine, then offered a polite bow and turned back toward the main floor. Her eyes instinctively drifted toward the center VIP table, but it was empty. Sang-ug-yom no longer sat in the center of the room. He had relocated to a quiet, shadowed corner booth, a vantage point that allowed him to watch over the entire establishment with his back to the wall. He sat perfectly still, a phantom in a tailored suit, sipping a glass of bourbon. The ruthless executioner who had severed his own right hand to save his empire was resting. In his place sat a quiet, watchful guardian. As Angelia passed his booth, she didn't avert her eyes or tremble in fear. She paused just for a fraction of a second, and met his obsidian gaze. She offered a small, deeply respectful inclination of her head, a silent acknowledgement of the life he had given back to her. Sang-ug did not smile. He rarely did. But as he looked at the waitress, whose single tear had exposed the cracks in his reign, a subtle, grounding peace settled over him. He gave her a single, slow nod in return. Angelia turned and walked back into the golden light of the dining room, safe, secure, and completely free, leaving the fearsome boss in the shadows to watch over his newly purified kingdom.